Here on the Morning Wake Up, where the president this week did an about-face, quite a pivot on immigration and separation of detainee families at the border. That had been the policy. Children were taken, some quite young, babies, infants, toddlers. You saw the video. There was a level of outrage in the country that followed this. Some of it, I'm going to tell you, some of it was using pictures that weren't accurate, memes that were baloney, and I would look at that and, that was not impressive. But others were using stuff that was legit from legit news sources, and people were angry over this. And that level of anger eventually got through. But what about the overall policy of detention at the border, indefinite detention? This morning, partner at Forward Solution Strategy Group. He's a Dem strategist, fair labeling. Isaac, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I appreciate you being here today. What was your overall impression of him? The left, I think, feels vindicated. The far right says, well, he may have done what he had to do, but he buckled, and he better not buckle anymore. Where do you stand on this one?
I think it's way more complex than that. There is this sort of 8, 9, or 11-month-old infant in Michigan whose parent is being detained in parts unknown of this country, and they haven't seen each other for 30 days. There was no effort to solve the problem he'd already created in 2,300 young lives who were here by no decision of their own.
Isaac,
I think that is
Isaac. I want in the glass half full versus half empty category. I mean, at least we can say this. We've had folks on here from Samaritas, which former Lutheran Social Services, also looked into what Bethany is doing. These are two large services that are working with that population right now. At least I can tell you this: they're both first rate. Okay, and with whatever living situation they're working on and have put together for those children, while things bureaucratically are sorted out, they're not going to warehouse them here. I know that. And they're going to work to have the best situation possible in Michigan, because I've worked with these agencies before. So there's my glass half full analogy. It's not saying that this is right, this is what you should do, et cetera. It's just we've got some working background and knowledge of these groups here in Michigan where we are taking kids right now. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think there have been any reports. Of failure of care by the people in Michigan who are assigned to care, like there have been in, say, Virginia, where there are reports of physical abuse to some, I think it's 14-year-old and younger immigrant children who have been detained in Virginia, or who've been detained and then sent to Virginia for longer-term detention. I don't think there's anything. I'm unaware of any accusations like that in Michigan the way there are in Virginia. The question is the trauma of the child. And regardless of the care of service, so to speak, being given right now, that child has been traumatically separated from their parents. And these children were still nursing, and the president has a responsibility to reunite those children.
I get where you're going with that, and I want to make, I don't speak for these organizations, but I can say this: they have both put out statements here. I mean, they oppose the policy. These organizations that are helping facilitate, they are actively opposing the policy of the separation. They don't believe that should be done. Now that that's stopped, I think their main focus is assuring that whatever gets done bureaucratically, that these kids are properly cared for, whether their time in refugee foster care here is a day, a week, or longer. They want to make sure that that's done to the best of their ability. We'll keep on that end of it. What about the overall policy of this indefinite detention?
I would point out, too, just really quickly, you mentioned one group, a Lutheran charity involved. People of faith have taken a brave stand in this fight to say, do the right thing, take care of these children, reunite these children, that we have to honor refugees seeking asylum, that it is a biblical value. And I think that is a great stand for people of faith who've engaged in the debate. And I noticed, as you just mentioned, one of the groups you mentioned was a Lutheran charity that has taken that stand. I don't want to distract, but I just want to point that out because I think that is really an important thing to note in the ongoing conversation.
Well, you know what, though? And that's an interesting thing you just noted. And I'll note something back, though, since you come at things from the Democratic side, is that some of those agencies take heat in Michigan because there are those who believe that the state itself in Michigan, the state of Michigan, should be in control of all of that kind of child welfare, as opposed to having these groups that are kind of that buffer involved with it. And yeah, for placements and foster and adoption, they get paid, but they've done a pretty good job of it over the years, and they can, but there's a back and forth on that it shouldn't be involving faith-based industries, and faith-based groups. But as you just said, they have taken a pretty strong stance, not just here in Michigan, but in other places during this flap over immigration and children. So I wanted to note that. I want to ask you about indefinite detention. Is that hasn't changed, nor has zero tolerance. Is that going to be a wedge issue going forward, or is that one that maybe Dems have to be careful with, because there's a lot of outrage about seeing what's happening with kids here, but that doesn't mean that people are saying, yeah, let's open the borders and have a completely tolerant policy. Doesn't mean that either, does it?
Well, you just hit on the bigger issue, right? And that was one of the things we were talking about earlier, was where the president's actions yesterday fell short. And one was not dealing with the long-term indefinite detention scenario. We are talking about keeping children with their parents, but still indefinitely detained. And that does not solve the immigration crisis in this country. It does not solve the fact that we are criminalizing refugees seeking asylum from some of the most violent and dangerous countries in the world.
But that's Congress's job.
Coming to our borders.
That's Congress's job. I mean, the president signed this, but he's not going to be able to solve the immigration issue with an executive order. That's Congress's job, isn't it?
Well, I think it's our politicians' job in general. And I think that there's massive failure on it. I think the president's failure on separating children from their parents exacerbates the problem and trying to move it forward in a positive direction. And that's what we need is leadership. And there's just been a terrible vacuum of leadership. And that goes back to the nuances. Again, this is so much more complicated than perhaps some of the headlines represent. That's one of the important nuances of this. The president has lost so much credibility with Congress. And the Secretary of Homeland Security, for example, has lost so much credibility, I think, with the American people over the way this has been handled. You know, the president has said for weeks that this is a congressional matter, that his hands are tied, that he can't help but create this policy and enforce it was sort of nonsensical since he created it willfully and purposely. Why couldn't he address it himself? As recently as yesterday morning, before he signed the EO in the afternoon, he was still saying, well, there's just nothing I can do about this. I don't have the authority. I don't have the power. It's all up to Congress. And only hours later, he tacitly admitted, you know what, this was my doing. I created this mess. I'm going to at least begin to address it or nibble around the edges.
Well, if you say mess, all right, Isaac, if you say mess, Isaac, if you say mess based on the separation of the families, that I get. If you say mess based on our immigration system, the way it stands today, I mean, that predates the president. That predates the last president. This has been ongoing for a long time. Yeah. Okay. I just want to make sure we're clear on that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
There is a larger crisis that we need comprehensive immigration reform.
Isaac Wright here, Forward Solutions Strategy Group, Democratic strategist. Isaac, thanks for coming on today very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, good conversation. Morning Wake Up, 1320. We're coming back.